Show me the crypto. Show me the crypto. Show me the crypto.
In a world on the brink of disruption, two men will bring you clarity by interviewing some of the most intelligent and influential names in the blockchain world. Welcome to Show Me the Crypto with your hosts, Wade Patterson and Ulf Lonergan.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Show Me the Crypto. My name is Wade Patterson.
And I'm Ulf Lonergan.
We're a couple of friends from Canada who love learning about cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, and we're happy you're along for the ride. Whether you're a crypto virgin or you know your way around the block, we hope our interviews with some of the most intelligent and influential people in the blockchain space help deliver you with value. And on this episode, we're joined by returning guest and independent Ethereum educator, Anthony Sassano. Those who know Anthony's work may be shocked to learn that Ethereum wasn't even on his radar for the first year and a half of its existence. However, when Anthony finally discovered ETH in early 2017, he dove in headfirst and made it his life's focus. In 2019, Anthony co-founded EthHub, and in 2020, he launched the Daily Gwei. Today, Anthony is one of the most trusted voices in the Ethereum community. Anthony, welcome back to Show Me the Crypto.
Hey guys, it's really good to be back. We were discussing just before how long it's been since the first episode I did with you guys, like about 18 months, which is just crazy. It feels like 10 years in crypto time though, right?
100%. And so let's go back to that January 2021, because we went back and we watched that episode and there were some interesting points. The first was that you were experiencing a Twitter ban because ETH was at the price of 1,300 and you had said that it was going to hit all-time highs. You're not tweeting until it does. And then it dipped 30%. And around that time as well, you were telling us about NFTs. You were teaching us what NFTs were. And you said, can you believe it? The floor price of a CryptoPunk is $5,000. It's so expensive. Little did we know then we should have rushed out and bought some CryptoPunks at that price of what it ended up doing. So the first question is just kind of taking a look back over the last 18 months. What do you make of what has happened in the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like funny looking back on that because I guess December 2020 / January 2021 is where I believe the bull market really began in earnest, and we kind of entered that mania phase because of the fact, we recovered in kind of 2020. We had DeFi summer, but that was really just insider crypto people. I don't think we brought in many new people through that. But then the price of ETH and BTC was going up, and that obviously brings in a kind of host of new people. And then once they start breaking their all-time highs, I think that's when we get like a massive influx of new users. But what I couldn't really foresee is just how big some of the things would get. Like NFTs, for example, I thought they were going to be big, but they really blew me away completely. I had no idea that it would go that far. I mean, it basically did enter the mainstream kind of like consciousness, right? We had talk show hosts covering it. We had Instagram influencers getting on board with it for, wrong or right reasons. It doesn't matter. It still entered the kind of like mainstream consciousness. And then, Ethereum was a home of NFTs and still is, right? Like basically all the popular ones are on Ethereum. Even though we had obviously the high gas fees and things like that, people still used Ethereum. And then we had the rise of kind of these layer ones because of the Ethereum high gas fees. And I think that caught some people off guard, at just how popular some of them got. But it's funny because looking back on that now, they got really popular, but because a lot of it was popular with maybe the retail investors that were coming in, they kind of like left since the market crashed. So now those things are kind of like by the wayside. And then we have like the layer twos going live as well. DeFi continued to grow, like all these kind of like things just happening in 1 year. Definitely because the prices were going absolutely nuts. Like it was really, really crazy, the bubble that we experienced. And I think that the funny thing is like you can point to two key parts of 2021, May 2021 and November 2021, where we hit an all-time high in May and then we hit all-time high again in November. But there were two very, very different kind of like, I guess, like market rallies. Like I think leading up to May, it was definitely the proper rally that we're used to. But then going into November, it felt like what people were calling a low conviction rally, where it was like all this just extra money floating around from all the money printing and all the kind of like macroeconomic stuff that led us to those new all-time highs. And then we came down, you know, obviously over the last 6 to 8 months or whatever it is from that. So very interesting cycle. Like we always like to call these things cycles in crypto. Very different, I think, to previous ones. You know, there are similarities, of course, like things went up too high and then we came down inevitably. And you know, most retail investors didn't take any profit, so they're gone now. But I think that just the different kind of like things like NFTs, and obviously DeFi started it, and layer ones and layer twos is very funny, because in 2017 really all we had was ICOs, but in this last cycle ICOs weren't really a thing. Like there were token sales, but it wasn't at the same scale or even kind of like in the same like narrative frame as ICOs were. And it's always funny how like there seems to be different narratives each cycle, which kind of perpetuate that kind of like market activity.
It was really a different cycle, I think, in the eyes of a lot of investors and just everybody who's following crypto prices. And I think that shocked a lot of people in the way that it played out with these, again, sort of two peaks there were, and really a full crash in between, depending on how you want to measure it. What's your take on how it played out in regards to what people were expecting? And do you think that will change what people expect might happen with the crypto market during the next, bull and bear run, the full cycle?
I think the similarities, I think the major one is that people always have inflated expectations, right? Like they always think that because something is doing really well for maybe the last 3 months of a bull market, they think they extrapolate that out and they say, oh, wow, this thing's going to be absolutely massive. It's going to take over the world and this is going to continue. Whereas that's never the case. No matter the kind of like narrative, no matter the use case, we've seen it time and time again that yes, these things can get really, really big and look like they're going to take over the world, but they can come down really, really quickly as well. So, I mean, there are a lot of clear examples here. I think NFTs may have somewhat bucked the trend, even though their volumes came down. I think NFTs have been like a very kind of like resilient use case, and there's still a lot of activity there. But the layer ones, for example, and American people, some people call me an ETH maxi for saying this, whatever. But with the layer ones, like, within the span of like 3 to 6 months of them kind of getting, activity, getting popularity and things like that, people started having these grand kind of like theses around the kind of like multi-chain thesis. They're like, oh my God, the world's going to be multi-chain. Ethereum's going to lose all its market share. We're going to have all these blockchains. It's going to be amazing. And then over the last 6 months, since that kind of like those things have come down, we've seen the perils of kind of like what multi-chain can bring with it, with a lot of these bridge hacks and things like that. And a lot of these other changes being inherently insecure, not decentralized, all that sort of stuff, right? People are now changing their thesis again and saying, oh, maybe it isn't just going to be the multi-chain thesis. Maybe it's going to be Ethereum and rollups. And it's like, okay, well, I believe that obviously, but I think that people have this kind of like 6 to 12 month lag on their kind of like narratives in this space. And a lot of it is influenced by short-term market action, which I think plays its kind of like role in every single market cycle. That is definitely the main similarity that I have kind of picked up on. So I think that's what happened to, from May to November. Like obviously we came off really, really quickly in May. I think within a week we went from like 4,400 ETH to 1,700. It was one of the biggest crashes ever in crypto's history. But then we started going back up again. There was a lot of hype around EIP 1559, of course, on Ethereum, but there was a lot of NFT activity still driving a lot of new money. And I think there was a lot of leverage. Like we saw recently all of these kind of like funds blowing up, the Terra ecosystem blew up, all that sorts of stuff. But there was a lot of leverage coming from big institutional players, 3RS Capital being one of them. And I think that's why we were able to go up to November, but people call it a low conviction rally because it was just people with a lot of money that they made, during the kind of like bull market, leveraging up again and kind of like perpetuating that super cycle as it kind of like got known as. And they kind of like willed it into reality a little bit, but then it was just too much because you don't have that new fresh capital coming in. There's only so much existing capital that can hold the price up to an extent, right? And then, the macro environment turned very violently where the Fed started raising rates, started going hawkish. They kind of like said, well, we're going to raise rates. We're not going to turn on the money printer for the foreseeable future. And then the stock market came down as well. And then obviously the war with Ukraine and everything just kind of compounded together. So we had this kind of like domino effect after it. But I think those are kind of like major differences too to the last cycles where the macro environment didn't really play into things as it has now. But it just taking like a crypto first context and just looking in crypto itself, there's been a bunch of different things that led to a bunch of different kind of like weird and unusual outcomes and unexpected outcomes that shocked people. And then I think there's been things that have actually kind of blown up in a spectacular fashion, which we see every cycle. But the Terra thing, I think, caught everyone off guard. Even the people who were calling for Terra's kind of like demise, so to speak, where they knew it was going to blow up because it was just unsustainable. I don't think anyone expected it to happen that quickly. Like within 3 days, it went from I think it was worth $50 billion at that point point to $0 in 3 days. And it took a lot of the ecosystem with it, because it wasn't just, everyday retail investors in it. It was institutions, VCs, funds, all these kind of players, and they got blown up. And then they had to kind of sell other assets to pay off those kind of like debts that they got blown up on. There were a lot of fund redemptions. And that's why I think we've seen, obviously we saw ETH go to triple digits again, but that's why I think we saw that, because there was just so much forced selling. And I don't think we have seen that in prior cycles, but not to that extent. We've seen some parties, like especially in 2018, the ICOs, they weren't particularly forced to sell, but they were kind of, because they were like, okay, well, if we don't sell the ETH that we raised, we're not going to have any runway and we're going to go broke, essentially. So that was kind of like a different kind of forced sell. But for these funds and institutions and everything that got blown up on Terra and the market turned against them, especially those who were holding ST ETH and they wanted to kind of like get into ETH and exit that position, they were literally forced to sell. And a lot of the market knew about that. So the market was like, well, I'm not going to buy this thing if we know that there's all these players kind of like selling off. We'll just wait and see kind of like the waters settle down. And it happened to settle down around triple digit ETH there, around the 800s. And then we kind of like have come back up from there. But it's kind of like impossible to know where things go from here. Obviously, the macro environment is kind of like a big unknown hanging over everyone. But I think those are kind of like the main key differences this cycle. But there are similarities to previous ones. I think just the scale always gets bigger, right? We were worth 3 trillion at the top, still worth 1.1 trillion now. Whereas the last cycle, we peaked at a kind of like a lower amount, and probably the next cycle will peak at a higher amount. And it's just always those kind of like ebbs and flows between, I guess, like greed and FOMO, and that driving all these kind of like narratives and prices. And yeah, it gets really messy, and you can unpack it all and try to understand it, but it's just a crazy amount of variables happening all at once.
Well, I think you did a pretty good job unpacking it all, so I appreciate that. One thing you did mention there was maximalism. And when we spoke 18 months ago, that we did have a bit of a conversation around maximalism within the crypto space. It's been 18 months since then. What's the current state of maximalism? How do you look at it today? And what do you think? How do you think it's maybe changed from 18 months ago, if at all?
Well, I think recently, maybe over the last 3 months, there's been a lot of kind of like, I guess, within the Bitcoiner circles, a lot of rejection of Bitcoin maximalism from some of the prominent voices. So some people may know, well, probably most people will know Nick Carter, who's been a very prominent voice in the Bitcoin community for a very long time. He's gone against Bitcoin maximalism pretty violently, I think is the right word here. And he's copped a lot of flack for it. There's also been Eric Wall, who's been against them for a while, but he's kind of like being more vocal about it. And, some other people in that kind of like ecosystem. So that's led to a bit of a fracture there. And there's been a bunch of people kind of like excommunicated, so to speak, from that community. But I've always thought that like people love to use maximalism as this term, as this kind of like catch-all term, where it's much more nuanced. People say, you're an Ethereum maximalist if all you focus on is Ethereum and you don't like the other layer ones. It's like, okay, well, I think you're using the term wrong there. The kind of like original meaning of the term was that, and it was applied to Bitcoin maximalists who basically thought everything else was a scam. Bitcoin was the only kind of like holy blockchain that you had to use, and it would kind of like scale to the world and everyone would use Bitcoin. Everything else is kind of like trash. Whereas like, I don't believe that about Ethereum, right? I don't believe Ethereum is going to be the only thing that wins. I do believe Ethereum is going to be the big thing. It is right now. I believe in continued Ethereum dominance. I believe that the Ethereum rollup centric roadmap for scaling is the best one that we have today in terms of scaling. And I believe a lot of the L1s are actually just bad projects. I don't believe they're scams. Like some of them are, but not most of them. But I believe that they're bad projects from a technical perspective. Whereas I think in Bitcoin maximalism, it's definitely more about the ideology rather than the technical merits of the thing. So I kind of like really take issue with people equating, ETH maxis with BTC maxis. Not that I really think there are ETH maxis at the end of the day, but if your definition of maximalism is someone just, it focuses on one ecosystem and one ecosystem only and ignores everything else, I think that misses the forest for the trees. Because personally, I don't ignore everything else. I know, very well how a lot of these other L1s work. I actually look into them because I'm thinking, okay, is there anything interesting here that could be applied to Ethereum that could help Ethereum? But my reasons for preferring Ethereum over everything else are long. Like I have a very, very long list of why I prefer Ethereum over everything else. I mean, the very top of that list is the fact that Ethereum, I believe, is the only truly decentralized smart contract blockchain in existence today. And obviously Bitcoin is a decentralized blockchain as well, but it doesn't do smart contracts, right? Can only do, BTC transfers, really. I mean, there is the Lightning Network and things like that, but I believe the Lightning Network is a fundamentally flawed kind of like product as well. So, people look at that and they're like, oh, you just kind of got massive ETH bags and you're just an ETH maxi and you just believe in Ethereum because of that. But I always use the argument is I have ETH, I own ETH because I believe in Ethereum, right? I don't believe in Ethereum because I have ETH, which I think is a very, very good distinction there. So I think maximalism has kind of like evolved in that sense, and I think that it's kind of like a term that's just like misunderstood. I struggle to use it myself most of the time these days. I think there definitely are people who fit into the classic definition of like literally, you see them on Twitter. They've got like laser eyes, they've got lightning bolts in their Twitter name, they've got like volcanoes in their Twitter name, referencing the volcano mining in El Salvador. And they speak as if, as kind of like religious cultists, so to speak, right? They speak like that with such certainty that Bitcoin is the only thing that matters. Everything else is a scam. Bitcoin's going to rule the world. And I don't see people in Ethereum doing that at all. Like, I don't see anything close to that in Ethereum. I see people saying that they believe Ethereum's roll-up centric roadmap is the best way to scale a blockchain. They believe a lot of these other L1s are taking shortcuts and kind of like compromising on that for short-term benefit, where the long-term benefit is just not going to be there. And we actually see it play out. Like, people called for example, the Solana thing, like them falling over, kind of like a network going offline. People have been calling that out, being like, you can't not have a fee market. You can't not have a way to control spam, control kind of like transactions hitting the network, because then you open yourself up to a denial of service attack, which is what we've seen in kind of like Solana there. And now they've implemented a fee market. They've implemented kind of quality of service, I guess, like technology, where they drop transactions that they that appear to be spam or appear to be trying to DOS the network. So there are kind of like a lot of technical reasons why people don't appreciate or don't like these other kind of like L1s and think that Ethereum is doing things right. I think it's wrong to call that maximalism. I think you can attack the merits of the argument. You can say, okay, well, roll-ups suck because of this, and this reason. As long as those reasons make sense technically, I'm fine to debate those people. But a lot of the time, it might be just, roll-ups suck because they're not my technology, or roll-ups suck because they're not this technology. Whereas I think that, pretty much all the other layer ones out there have compromised on decentralization, and by virtue compromised on security. So I'm just not interested in them. Like, if I was interested in something like a Solana, where it's basically got a very small set of validators, it has pumped up the hardware requirements, not many people can run nodes, all that sorts of stuff. If I was interested in that, then kind of like I would gravitate towards that. But I'm just not, because I think that it looks more like an AWS than it does a blockchain. So why do I really care about that? That to me is not something that is actually revolutionary, that is kind of like decentralized and actually trying to affect positive change in the world. And for newcomers to this ecosystem, they're not going to understand that. I totally get that, because I always use this argument with people. If you put Ethereum and Solana in front of people, for example, like completely new people to crypto, they've got zero prior context, they have absolutely no idea what's going on, and they're used to the Web 2 world where everything is free in quotation marks, obviously, but they're going to look at Ethereum and be like, okay, well, to send tokens on this chain, it costs me a few dollars. To send tokens on Solana, it costs me basically nothing. They're going to obviously think that Solana is better because they have no prior context of how Solana achieves that. They think Solana and Ethereum are basically equal in what they do. And from that perspective, I totally understand why people think that Ethereum is broken or old technology or doesn't work, blah, 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 right? But once you dig into the weeds, once you actually get down into the technology and actually understand why these decisions were made, you kind of come to terms with the fact that, okay, well, Ethereum is actually doing things the right way, or at least the way that we think is the right way, right? And they're trying to scale in a very sustainable way instead of taking shortcuts. But I think that's why you saw the L1 kind of like narrative rally last year, because there was still a lot of retail investors around, especially because of NFTs, and they gravitate towards that. And I think everyone needs a cycle or two to kind of like get kind of like familiar with these things and learn. It is definitely something that can't be taught like overnight. It needs to be learned through practice. It's more of a kind of like wisdom than a knowledge sort of thing. I think that's where the maximalism kind of like term comes from for people. It's not just that they kind of like ascribe maximalism to people who think that everything else is a scam. They ascribe it to people who they view as, oh, you don't believe in the multi-chain thesis, you only believe in Ethereum, but Ethereum's broken. You must be kind of like a maximalist. And what I always find funny as well is that a lot of these people, they don't even believe in the multi-chain thesis. They believe in their chain, right? If they're a Solana fan, they're pumping Solana up. They're like, oh, the multi-chain. They're only saying multi-chain because they know Ethereum is dominant, so they have to acknowledge Ethereum. But in reality, you could call them a Solana maximalist, for example, right? But that would not be accurate from my framing, but you could make that argument too. So I always find it funny when people talk, and the world is multi-chain. It's like, okay, you're only saying it's multi-chain because Ethereum is dominant and you want your chain to kind of like grow and be accepted as part of like this multi-chain world, when in reality, you maybe only care about one, maybe two chains as well, so to speak. So yeah, that's kind of like, I guess, my nuanced view on maximalism. I do think that Bitcoin maximalism is going to become more and more of a minority and more of a kind of like segregated part of the community. But I do think it's done a lot of harm to Bitcoin over the last few years. I don't know if Bitcoin can quote unquote recover from that. And I don't know what recovery even looks like for them. Like, do they want to implement smart contracts? Do they want to implement more functionality for the chain? Or do they just want to keep Bitcoin still as simple as possible and do everything else, or try to do everything else at layer 2 on Bitcoin, so to speak? But I don't know. I feel like it's too far gone at this point. I feel like that maximalism has turned off a lot of people. And I also feel like, as orthogonal to that, the proof of work maximalism in Bitcoin is also very harmful because of the fact that the wider world hates proof of work, right? For better or worse, doesn't matter about the arguments that surround it. There is this really bad narrative against it. So I think that those kind of like that kind of maximalism is very damaging, and it remains to be seen what happens there. But I've been tooting that horn for a long time. Like, I've been kind of like intellectually bearish on Bitcoin. The price will probably go up because that's just what happens. But intellectually bearish means that I don't see Bitcoin evolving or doing anything more than what it's doing now, and it's going to lose to superior solutions, I think, long term.
Ulf, do you realize our audience has been either watching or listening to this episode for 20 minutes?
20 minutes? No, they should probably subscribe.
Yeah, they should subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment and turn on notifications. And if you're listening to this podcast, especially if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating and a review.
We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. So go check out the episode description. You can find all that information below. And we have an update on the NFT, don't we?
That's right. We didn't previously mention this, but this NFT for OG supporter is a one of one. There will only be one of this kind ever minted, and we have a few surprises for the person who purchases it. The link is in the episode description.
And back to the episode.
Anthony, one of the things you had mentioned there in that description of maximalism and the way you see it is newcomers and kind of giving them the leeway of not fully understanding or grasping everything behind Ethereum and why there are higher fees and all of those sorts of things. That's one of the big targets of our show, is to help inform those who are new to the space. So with that in mind, one of the big focuses we want to shift to in this episode is the merge, the upcoming merge, because a lot of people have probably heard about it, and we're hoping that you can help guide us through and just create a really good episode that anyone who has questions on specific things can come to this as a resource and understand it a little bit better. One note is that we are recording this on August 2nd. So obviously things change very quickly in the crypto space. So the listener, the viewers are aware of that. But can you just walk us through at a high level what the merge is all about, and maybe kind of starting with the Beacon chain and when that was released and what this is all about, the merge coming together?
Yeah. So I'll try my best to condense this because it is a large topic and I could go into any number of directions. But basically, the merge represents the culmination of many years of work to move Ethereum to proof of stake. So it basically started all the way back when Ethereum was first conceived by Vitalik. He was talking about proof of stake and wanting to move Ethereum towards that. There was a lot of hype around it. There wasn't really any implementations or anything live until December 2020, where the Beacon chain went live, December 1st, 2020. So the Beacon chain is basically a separate network that is a full proof of stake Ethereum implementation. Now, this exists entirely separately to the Ethereum that we all know and use today. The Beacon chain is really only for staking. So if you want to stake, you can. You send your ETH into what's called the deposit contract on the existing Ethereum chain that we all use, and that gets credited to you on the Beacon chain, and then you can kind of stake. And if you want to be a solo staker, then that's how you kind of like stake and validate on that network. But you're basically validating empty blocks because there's no transactions, there's no activity on there except the proof of stake kind of like protocol running. And this was done because we didn't want to shift Ethereum, the ETH1 network, so to speak, as it's known, to an untested mechanism for safety reasons, for security reasons. So that's been running since then. It's coming up on 2 years, December this year, since it's been kind of like live. There has been, I don't think, any major bugs with it at all, really. I think it's been running really, really well. It has like 13 million ETH staked or something these days. So it's pretty crazy in terms of kind of like growth there for something that isn't validating transactions or anything like that. So now, okay, we have these two separate networks. We need to merge them together. So the merge is the name that was given to that effort. And that's been something that's been worked on since the Beacon chain went live, of course. And it's now culminated in kind of like a lot of testing that's happened over the last couple of years, a lot of testing to get this right. There's things called shadow forks that people may have heard of. There are test nets that have been spun up for this. There's a lot of kind of like internal dev nets and things like that have been done to make sure that we can actually do this thing. And essentially what the merge is, it's very simple at the end of the day. Like there is a lot of work that's gone into it, but it's very simple. And end users actually won't really feel anything if the merge goes through as we hope it does. So essentially what happens is that at one kind of like block, at block number so-and-so, it will be proof of work. And then at the immediate next block, it will be proof of stake. So essentially proof of work, what we're kind of like used to validating the network today, the miners and everything like that, will be immediately replaced literally in the next block. And blocks on Ethereum are around 13 seconds. In proof of stake, they're 12 seconds. So it's basically the same. It'll be immediately proof of stake validating your transaction. So the Beacon chain basically gets merged into the existing chain, swaps out, replaces proof of work with kind of proof of stake, and that's it. The users, nothing changes for end users, really. I mean, as I said, the block times get slightly faster. Instead of around 13 seconds, they're kind of like 12 seconds now, but you won't really notice anything. It doesn't lower gas fees. It doesn't kind of like make it different kind of to interact with the chain. Everything will logically work the same as it did before. It's just that in the background, we have the proof of stake Beacon chain validating the network, securing the network instead of the proof of work, miners doing so. So that's basically the merge in a nutshell. Now, where we are today is we're very, very close. Like, obviously, our last podcast was 18 months ago. We weren't as close, nowhere near as close as we are today. Today, we are potentially, you said August 2nd, we're recording this. So we're potentially 6 to 7 weeks away from the merge happening. So very, very, very soon. Now, some people will kind of like listen to that and be like, this has been talked about for so long, we'll believe it when we see it. And that's fine. But I can tell you right now that like the fact that it's 6 to 7 weeks away is exactly that, a fact, because of two main reasons. The last public test net to go through the merge transition is called Girly. It's happening between August 10th and 12th. That, it obviously happening very, very soon. August 2nd, we're recording this 8 to 10 days from now. Maybe this comes out later. Maybe it's already happened. If all goes well with that, which we expect it to, because we already had two other public test nets, Ropsten, Sepolia, go through just fine. If all goes well with Girly, there is absolutely no reason for the tentative date that was given for the mainnet merge to be pushed back or to be delayed or anything like that. So the tentative date given was the week of September 19th, which is 6 to 7 weeks away from kind of like today. And, as I said, if the testnet goes well, that mainnet merge date will be kind of like kept. So we really are that close at this point. Now, it's funny that kind of like when I think about that, because there are a lot of people still denying this and still thinking that, oh no, the merge isn't going to happen. It's kind of like been talked about for so long. Ethereum is never going to be proof of stake, and people will probably believe that right up until it happens. And there are obviously a lot of people concerned about like the risks with something like this, and there are risks, but that's why there's been extensive testing done, and we're basically doing the same thing on mainnet that we've been doing on the test nets. Like it's not anything different, but the thing with mainnet is that there's real value at stake. Obviously, there's a lot of infrastructure providers, a lot of users kind of like surrounding it. So some things may inevitably break on the infrastructure side, but that has nothing to do with the kind of like merge itself. It's more to do with these infrastructure providers needing to update their software or update their kind of like processes to support the network. But in reality, if all goes well with the merge transition, which we expect it will, because the test nets have been going really well, then there shouldn't be any real disruption to end users or disruption to the network. So that's how close we are today. Now, there has been a bunch of really bad narratives surrounding the merge that I wanted to quickly clear up for people. So the one around gas fee. So the merge has nothing to do with scalability for Ethereum. It lays the groundwork for later upgrades to bring more scalability to Ethereum. But I mentioned before, Ethereum is scaling via this rollup centric roadmap, which is basically these layer twos that people would have heard of, such as Arbitrum, Optimism, the ZK EVM, all these things people would have heard of. That's the layer 2 roadmap. Now, the way layer 1 Ethereum is being kind of constructed is to support those layer 2s. So any scalability upgrades that come to layer 1 Ethereum is going to be beneficial to layer 2s and layer 2s alone. People in kind of like the end state of Ethereum, no one should be transacting on Ethereum layer 1. They'll be transacting on Ethereum layer 2. And the only things to be happening on layer 1 Ethereum is probably whales kind of like interacting on there because they can afford the fees, or layer 2 settling their kind of like transactions to layer 1 and securing themselves via that way. But that's kind of like the scalability roadmap for Ethereum in a nutshell there. So the merge itself does not materially lower gas fees. There is technically some extra capacity on the chain because the block times go from 13 seconds to 12 seconds, but that is such a small kind of like insignificant thing. I think it's around 8%. That I don't think users are going to feel that at all. So that's why I say the merge does not reduce gas fees. It never was planned to. And proof of stake and proof of work, they've got nothing to do with the scalability of a chain. Some people may think that it doesn't. They're just kind of like, they're actually called Sybil resistant mechanisms. The consensus mechanism is something baked into that. It's different. Ethereum uses something called Gasper, which is the kind of consensus mechanism, where proof of stake is the Sybil resistant mechanism to make sure that it kind of like just all fits and works together. Second bad narrative is that people think that you need 32 ETH to run a full node after the merge takes place. No, that is not the case. You only need 32 ETH to become a solo validator on the network. So if you wanted to stake at home, fully solo, fully sovereign, not relying on any other personal infrastructure to do so, you need 32 ETH to do that. But you don't need 32 ETH to run a full node, right? You can run a full node for free on your hardware, just as you can pre-merge. You can run, so in post-merge, you need to run 2 clients. It's either an execution layer client and a consensus layer client. An execution layer, you can run something called Geth. People may have heard of that before, Go Ethereum. And then on the consensus layer side, you run something called a Prism, Beacon node. So there are different implementations of this. There's about 5 on either side there, but I'm just giving examples for the sake of argument here. They're to be run completely free. You don't need 32 ETH to do that. And you can validate the chain on your own consumer hardware, just as you would but prior to the merge. So that's another bad narrative that I've seen kind of like swing around. And there are like a bunch of others out here. I think another big one is the kind of like ETH being unlocked from staking at time of the merge. That's not happening. So what happens is that with the merge, all that happens is that kind of like hot swap between proof of work and proof of stake. The staked ETH does not become unlockable or withdrawable at time of the merge. It's still in there. You can't withdraw it out. You can't unlock it. You can't stop staking. That happens 6 to 12 months after the merge. So basically, the funny thing is at time of the merge, we drop issuance as well because it's actually in proof of stake, it's cheaper to validate than in proof of work. So we're dropping issuance by about 80% instantly, but also no new issuance can enter the market because there's no withdrawals enabled. So no one, any of the kind of like rewards you get for validating on the network that are coming from the network itself, you can't actually withdraw for 6 to 12 months after the merge because there's going to be another upgrade that enables these kind of like withdrawals to take place. The only thing you'll be able to access is any fee revenue you earn as a validator. So any of the block rewards you won't be able to access until those withdrawals are enabled. And when they're enabled, it still doesn't mean that all the ETH can just be unstaked at once. What ends up happening is that there's a queue called a validator queue. And right now, only about 40,000 ETH per day can actually be withdrawn from the Beacon chain and can be kind of like unstaked, so to speak. And that is put in place because obviously you don't want a scenario where millions can be withdrawn all at once. And then that's kind of like the network becoming insecure, network becoming unstable. And there's all this kind of like funny business that could go on because of that. So that's why there's kind of like a queue. And the queue works the other way around as well, where there's like an entry queue that kind of like scales up. So the more validators there are on the network, it reaches a certain point and they'll allow more validators in when it reaches that point or more validators out. And that's how it works. It doesn't work on ETH stake, it works on validators. And obviously one validator is 32 ETH. So that's where you get the ETH number from. So that's a really bad narrative that I've seen kind of like perpetuated by people where they think that all of a sudden there's going to be millions of ETH kind of like hitting the market and then kind of like everyone's going, and then the ETH price is just going to go to zero. Like I just kind of like think it's bizarre to think like that because if you really think through it from first principles, it would mean that like the Ethereum kind of like chain would become instantly insecure, it would become unstable, and kind of like everyone would be affected by that. Whereas that's not the case. The case is that there's this kind of this queue that kind of like happens there. So I think those are the 3 things people need to keep in mind about the merge and about the bad narratives surrounding it, and how none of those are kind of like are true. So if you see anyone kind of like saying that, maybe you want to correct them on it, or maybe just kind of like, disregard that kind of like opinion. But I get why people kind of like think this, because there is a lot of people out there that just spread this kind of like bad information because they just don't know what they're talking about. They might see someone on Twitter saying it and they'll just run with it. They're like, oh, okay, this person must know what they're talking about. I'm going to talk about this on my show if they've got like a YouTube show or something like that. And it is kind of like a nuanced thing where I think the kind of like gas fees thing is definitely something that people think that the merge is going to lower because of the fact that the merge is such a major upgrade. They just assume that in that upgrade, there's going to be a way to fix the gas fees. When in reality, we have been fixing the gas fees now for almost 2 years with the layer 2s that have been kind of live and coming online. And if you use them, you have really, really cheap transactions. And obviously, they're not as cheap as some of these other layer 1s, but that's because they're inheriting Ethereum security and they're relying on Ethereum layer 1 as well. So as I mentioned before, there are upgrades coming after the merge. That one of them is called proto-dank sharding, and it hopefully will come early next year to essentially make roll-up transactions or layer 2 transactions really, really cheap. And I'm talking, right now at current gas prices on Ethereum layer 1, these layer 2 transactions are about 20 to 30 cents for a swap on Optimism or Arbitrum, right? After proto-dank sharding is implemented, this would potentially go to sub 1 cent transaction fee. So literally like very rock bottom prices. But at the end of the day, you still inherit Ethereum security as well. So it's not like you're going to a different network, which is much less secure, much less battle tested. You get the full Ethereum security along with that, and you inherit all of the goodies from that as well. And you can still use it like with your MetaMask wallet, with your Ethereum wallet, because these things are what's called EVM compatible, where they still work the same as Ethereum layer 1 works. And they have, most of the, both Arbitrum and Optimism today have a lot of the apps, if not all of the apps that layer 1 has deployed on there. Maybe it doesn't have as much liquidity, but you still can do a lot of the same things. So I think people have been, for some reason, ignoring this build out of this extremely scalable layer 2 ecosystem that we've kind of like been doing, and laser focused on this narrative around the merge lowering gas fees, where I thought was just like kind of like not a great thing to focus on, and definitely something that is not even true. So yeah, those are kind of like the main things there. And hopefully that gives like a merge in a nutshell thing. As I said, 6 to 7 weeks from August 2nd is hopefully when the mainnet merge is going to go through. End users are not going to really feel anything. That's kind of like the ideal case where end users can just keep using the Ethereum chain as they did before, but now it's a proof of stake chain. As for the market impact here, I'm not going to give like investment advice, but I have kind of talked about before how I think that the merge is an extremely bullish catalyst for ETH as an asset because of that issuance reduction as a primary factor. But there's a bunch of secondary factors as well, such as the narrative changing from Ethereum is a dirty proof of work network to Ethereum is a clean proof of stake network. And narratives don't have to be based on like truth or what's right or wrong. A narrative is just something that people talk about and people spread. It's a story. Now, I don't necessarily believe that proof of work is as evil as people make it out to be, but I don't necessarily believe it's a good thing either. But it's all about the narrative. Like everyone outside of crypto thinks proof of work is proof of waste, so to speak, whereas they realize that proof of stake is clean and energy efficient and green because it uses 99.99% less energy than proof of work does, right? So that narrative is going to be a huge boon for Ethereum as well. But yeah, I think that issuance reduction is definitely kind of like the main thing there. That's going to lead to like a really bullish catalyst for ETH. But yeah, I don't want to go any further than that because I'm not in the interest of giving investment advice. But I think anyone who follows me knows that I'm like an ETH ultra bull, and a lot of my bull case for ETH is based on the merge, proof of stake, things like ERP 1559, things like rollups and scalability coming as well, so that Ethereum can still be the premier kind of decentralized network while scaling. Because it doesn't really matter if we're ultrasound money, as they call it. Doesn't matter if ETH is really bullish as an asset if no one can use the chain. Like we obviously want to be able to kind of scale to the world, make sure that everyone can use the chain. And that's what we're doing with rollups, with layer 2s. And we're also laying the groundwork for that by doing the merge, getting Ethereum on proof of stake, laying basically the foundations. Like when you lay the foundations of a building, that's essentially what the merge is. Then we can put all the nice stuff on top of it, build the rest of the house, so to speak, so that people can kind of get the benefit from that. And that's what we're doing in later upgrades after the merge.
Now, you mentioned the potential price changes in ETH, and you're right, I don't want to get into that either. However, I do want to say to the audience, always do your own research. And one thing to consider, all the benefits of the merge aside, there is the buy the rumor, sell the news, and the way that people approach markets. And perhaps things like this are already priced in as well. So do be careful with your investments. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on that relates to potential price changes, potential price increases, as some may see it in ETH at some point down the road, is potentially also part of this bad narrative you speak of, primarily from a timing standpoint, I think, which is that when the merge happens, ETH becomes deflationary. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So as I said before, with the merge, the issuance is dropping by about 80 to 90%. Like, it depends on how much ETH is staked. Like, the more ETH that gets staked, the more issuance there is, but it's not really that high. So I think at current amount of ETH staked, it would drop by about 80% from what it is today. So today it's about, I think, 4.5% or something like that going to miners. And then kind of like post-merge in proof of stake world with the 30 million ETH staked, I believe it's like 0.6 or 0.7%. So obviously like a massive drop there. But on top of that, there's also the fact that miners are forced to sell because they have electricity costs, right? They have hardware costs, they have maintenance costs, they have all these costs that they can't get around, they can't ignore, they can't just sit. I mean, they can try it too, but it's really risky for them to just sit on the ETH and hope that it goes up in price, right? And then pay their bills later. No, they have to basically sell a lot of them. And a lot of the sell pressure for proof of work networks comes from the miners, right? For both ETH and BTC, for a lot of the others out there. I mean, if you look at all the other proof of work networks, most of them have not performed well at all. It's actually an outlier that ETH and BTC have performed so well as proof of work networks because of the fact that there's so much sell pressure. And I think a good way to quantify this, and this was actually brought to my attention, I never thought about it in this way before, but it was brought to my attention by Hal Press on his Bankless episode, which I think a lot of people would have listened to. He spoke about the fact that he truly believes that the cycles are directly influenced by these minor flows. Because, for example, on ETH, there's 4.5% issuance, right, a year, which translates to 13,500 ETH per day going to miners. Now, not all of that would be sold, but I think most of it would be because of those fixed costs that miners have and the way that the market works, where you obviously want to get to a point where you're inching out as much profit as possible, but so is everyone else. So your profit margin may only be 5 to 10% on a mining operation. So that means the other 95% is being sold to cover the cost associated with your mining operation. So if you kind of look at this in ETH denominated terms, the 13,500 ETH that gets issued per day is fixed, no matter what the price of ETH is in US dollars. That's going to be 13,500 ETH until time of the merge, where it collapses to, I think, around probably 2,000 ETH per day or something like around that. But the US dollar kind of denominated value can fluctuate wildly. So for example, at $1,000 ETH, 13,500 ETH being kind of like sold by miners is a lot less than at $5,000 ETH, right? So the sell pressure, it just is varied based on the USD kind of like amount, and it's not varied based on the denominated amount in the native tokens such as ETH or BTC. So what that means is that at a $5,000 ETH, you need a lot of money coming in to offset that miner sell pressure. And as the price keeps going up faster and faster, the miners are probably going to be selling faster and faster too, because they are probably more experienced than most participants in knowing how these cycles work. So they're adding all this massive sell pressure every single day to the network. And the higher the USD price goes, the more sell pressure there is, which means that you need equal buy pressure to keep the price just the same, right? And you need more buy pressure to keep the price going up. Now, what ends up happening is that it reaches a point where there's not that much buy pressure coming in, and we inevitably fall. Right, we inevitably go down because of that, and the same is true for ETH as it is for BTC. And then it works the other way, where the price gets so low that we actually have more buy pressure coming in again than there is sell pressure from miners. That we kind of like start trending up again. And then there's obviously a very simple view of markets, and there's obviously a lot of other things that play into it. But I think that is a major factor in why we have such violent cycles. Is these kind of like miners that have to sell, and they're kind of like selling a lot more as the price goes up in USD denominated terms, and we just don't have the demand to match that, so we inevitably come down. Now, you flip this on its head in a proof of stake world, in a kind of like deflationary ETH world, where essentially you don't have stakers selling that ETH, because the only fixed cost that stakers really have is tax, like income tax. Right? A lot of stakers are going to be taxed based on income tax. It can vary from whatever it is. Like if it's a corporation in America, it's like, it depends on what they do. It kind of varies wildly, but let's just say there's a 30 to 50% kind of like fixed kind of tax on stakers that they have to sell ETH to cover those taxes. And maybe there's a small electricity cost and internet cost that they have to pay for every year as well. But that is dramatically less than what miners have to do. So you're already taking away all of that sell pressure, not even kind of like taking into account that the deflationary ETH that people quote is assuming that all of that ETH is going to be kind of like sold. Like it's based on ETH issued minus the burn, right? How much ETH is being burned. So at around a 10 to 20, I think, Gwei gas price on Ethereum layer 1 is when ETH is net deflationary. It basically it nets out to zero new ETH being issued a year because we're kind of like offsetting that new ETH issuance with the burn. But that's not taking into account that most of the ETH that's being staked, I believe, won't be, and so most of those rewards, or at least half of them, if you really want to take the conservative approach here, is probably not going to be sold, right? Unless people are taking profits, but it's not going to be sold as aggressively as miners sell theirs, because miners have those fixed costs that they have to sell for. It's not like let's take profit because I want to buy something fancy with my gains. It's I need to sell this stuff because my electricity supply is going to cut me off unless I pay them the bill, so to speak. So that is another element on top of the deflationary ETH that I think a lot of people miss, is that we flip it on its head with the market, where it's like, now we need to find the extra sell pressure to keep the price of ETH from going up. And this is kind of like how Hal Press framed it in his Bankless interview, where he basically said that if we're not having any sell pressure or very little sell pressure compared to what we had on the proof of work, and we have the same demand as we have today, right? The same demand, then the price should logically go up, because the price right now is in a sideways movement, but we're going to take away, like if the price action right now as it currently stands, it continues to be sideways. Maybe we range between, 1,500 and 1,700 or 1,400 and 1,700. And then the merge happens. And then we kind of like cut that issuance. We're cutting the issuance essentially by 100% with the merge, because of the fact that no one can kind of like sell their new ETH that's being issued until 6 to 12 months after the merge, when the withdrawals are enabled. ETH is still being issued, but none of it is hitting the market at all. Like nothing is hitting the market, because it just can't, because it's locked in there until the withdrawals are enabled. You take all that into account, and if demand for ETH remains the same as it is today, then logically the ETH price should trend up, right? Like it shouldn't go down, because where is that sell pressure coming from? It's not coming from the miners anymore, because they're gone. Like they've been basically fired from the network, right? In kind of like in lieu of these proof of stake kind of like validators. And then even when withdrawals are enabled, we still have that massively reduced sell pressure on the market. And then what happens when there's another bull cycle that comes along? What happens when we get a lot of new people in and a lot of new money in? Well, I mean, if ETH was able to go to $5,000 with that insane amount of sell pressure, right? This is how I think about it. Like, where's ETH going to go when we've basically deleted 80%, if not more, of that sell pressure, because of the fact that proof of stake is a much more efficient system? People don't need to sell, aren't forced to sell for anything but taxes, really, and a small electricity and internet cost, which they're probably going to offset with their regular income anyway. Like maybe they don't want to sell their ETH because they're like, well, I want to stack more ETH and I want to kind of like restake and keep kind of like growing my ETH stake, because I think ETH is going to go up. So it's this self-reinforcing kind of like flywheel that essentially makes me incredibly bullish on ETH over the long term. And that's kind of like the bull case in a nutshell for why I think that ETH is going to flip Bitcoin. I've said this, for years now, but I believe that is going to be the major catalyst for it. And I believe that because of that flywheel, and because of the fact that the staking is ETH denominated, people are going to want to get more ETH, so they're going to stake. So we're going to have more ETH being locked up in staking, right? We're going to have more ETH taken off the market. Just really not going to be much ETH out there for people to buy on the market. There's going to be a very, very small active supply, which means that any new demand that comes in is going to just put a really kind of like strong buy pressure on ETH, and it's going to put a really strong move on ETH to the upside. That's kind of like my whole thesis on it. I think logically it makes a lot of sense. Over the long term, short term, anything can happen, right? Like you can still have crashes. I'm not going to say that ETH is not going to crash, 20, 30% in a day ever again, right? Not at all. Like that can still happen. But over the longer term, logically, ETH, like with the amount of demand that it has for use as money, use as a store of value, use as an investment vehicle, use within DeFi, use for staking, use for kind of like money within NFTs, all of its, demand drivers, they're all still going to stay the same. They don't just go away. They're going to get stronger actually over time. So what do you think that is going to happen to the price of ETH once we eliminate all of that sell pressure? Like to me, thinking through it logically, like obviously not investment advice, but if you actually think through it step by step, there's nowhere for the ETH price to go over the long term except up, given, assuming that the demand stays the same as it is today and it grows, which I think it will. Like I think all signs point to that. That's obviously the speculative part of it. But if you do believe that ETH demand will stay the same as it is today, or it continues growing, then the ETH price will logically follow that, because because we've eliminated all of that sell pressure from something like miners, and also I've eliminated all of that kind of like bad narratives too around proof of work networks, which I think is a massive secondary effect that people have not thought of, because institutions and corporations actually don't want to touch a lot of these things because they're proof of work, right? They don't want the bad narrative. They don't want the bad PR. So if they can say, well, we're in Ethereum and Ethereum is green, that is a huge thing. Like, I don't think people realize the magnitude of that effect on people's consciousness, especially people who are very conscious about the environment. And as I said, for better or worse, for right or wrong, it doesn't matter. What matters is the narrative, and the narrative is going to be much, much better for Ethereum in a proof of stake world, which again adds to that flywheel effect there. So that's my kind of like bull case for Ethereum in a nutshell, why I'm so bullish on ETH long term, and why I just can't like be bearish on it basically.
I love seeing your passion for this subject, Anthony. And you're so informed on it, and so many good points that you just brought up there that I hadn't even thought about, which is really interesting. I want to go back to something that you were talking about in your description of the merge, and maybe this is my own ignorance, but did the plan switch at any point? Because I was surprised, I'll be honest, I was surprised when I first heard on an interview Vitalik explaining, I think it was also actually on the Bankless podcast, Vitalik explaining the fact that people are going to have to get used to using layer 2s, and just the question about, okay, so how is this going to change things on layer 1? And the fact that layer 1, it's not going to be like layer 1 is today. And people complained about, it's expensive to use, that it will continue and even more expensive kind of thing, and that we've got to switch our habits to using layer 2. So the first part of that question is just, was that kind of always the case, or did that switch at some point, the plans for that? And then the second part is, how do you think that will impact usability and adoption? Just knowing for my own self and my friends who, you try to explain how to use various cryptocurrencies, things like that. And there's already seems to be this huge friction level on the existing place of just working on layer 1. And the people who spend the time to figure it out, they get it before too long. But a lot of people, they hit that hindrance, then they just stop. Well, if you're now going onto a layer 2, it seems like you're adding some increased level of friction. So what are your thoughts around those 2 points?
Yeah, so to the first point, the Ethereum roadmap has definitely evolved a lot over the years. It has stayed true, I think, to most of what it wanted to do, but it's changed the implementation details. So, for example, Vitalik's been talking about proof of stake and sharding since day one. Proof of stake evolved a lot over the years. It is definitely not the original proof of stake that was envisioned, but it is a much better version, I think, than what was envisioned. And it took a lot longer to get to where we wanted it to be, but we got there. And I think it is the best proof of stake implementation that exists in crypto today. It is ultra secure. It scales really nicely. It is very stable. It's a very kind of, it lends itself to a very healthy network. And we also have a very healthy client, diverse client kind of like ecosystem as well. Sharding has evolved probably more dramatically than proof of stake. It started off very, very ambitiously. So originally the plan was to split the Ethereum blockchain into 1,024 different shards, and each of these shards would be like another ETH chain, right? Essentially, but they would have lower fees because obviously you would increase the capacity by splitting the chain up. That was abandoned a while ago, and it was kind of like abandoned in favor of only doing 64 shards. Then that was abandoned again in favor of not doing sharding in terms of kind of like executing transactions where everyone could kind of like use these shards and use them as they would use Ethereum today, into something that was called data sharding. Now, what this is basically it does sharding only for layer 2s. It basically just gives layer 2s more capacity to store their what's called core data, which is a technical term for essentially user state, so the state of the world on these chains, to kind of like layer 1 Ethereum and make it cheap for them to do so. But data sharding has no impact on users. Like, it doesn't mean that we can go and take advantage of it as end users on layer 1. We take advantage of it on layer 2. So essentially, layer 2's relationship to layer 1 is a B2B or business to business relationship, and layer 2's relationship to us is a business to consumer relationship. Whereas layer 1 Ethereum, you can still do business to consumer, right? You can still interact with it, but long term, it is not going to be the viable approach because it's going to be more expensive than layer 2's, and it's going to be kind of like a slower because the block times are going to be 12 seconds. On layer 2's, you can basically have instant transactions because of the fact that They don't have to do consensus and come to consensus on blocks. They basically just have to soft confirm the transaction and then post their transactions to layer one, and that layer one handles all that stuff for them, consensus being the security. So there's that. But also on the layer two front, layer twos have been talked about in Ethereum for a long time as well. They've always been a path to scalability for Ethereum, but they've evolved dramatically too. We had state channels originally as part of the Raiden network, and that came from the Lightning Network on Bitcoin. Then we realized that state channels are inherently very limited. They can only do payment systems and not very well as well. Then we came up with Plasma, which was an attempt at doing smart contracting on layer twos. That kind of like got abandoned because there was a bunch of inherent issues with that, but that evolved into rollups, which is what we use today. So Arbitrum and Optimism are what are called optimistic rollups. We have Starkware, ZK Sync, Polygon and stuff doing ZK rollups, ZK EVM, things like that. So it has evolved a lot over the years, but all the evolutions have been for the positive. They haven't been for the negative. They've been in kind of like in reaction to the fact that we found better ways of doing things. So that's how the Ethereum roadmap has changed dramatically. And I think that Vitalik posted recently, and he talked about it at his ETHCC talk, the Ethereum roadmap for the next 5 to 10 years. And he kind of has the merge, the surge, the purge, the verge, the splurge, these 5 kind of like phases, which are happening sequentially. They're not, they're happening in parallel, not sequentially. So the research and development is all happening at the same time for these sorts of things. And they're all different phases of kind of like the Ethereum roadmap that probably, I wouldn't say set in stone, but they're just the general thing that we're going to be following from now on. There's not going to be any of these, I think, major changes anymore. I think the Ethereum community and ecosystem is all in on this roll-up centric roadmap where people can kind of like use these layer twos, these roll-ups for their transactions, get all the benefits of the scalability there, and leave layer one to be this ultra secure, decentralized settlement layer that people call it, so that we can kind of like keep that decentralized and secure without sacrificing that in order to achieve scale, but also achieve scale at these layer twos. Which brings me to the second part of your second question here, which is around maybe fragmentation and complexity of having a layer two ecosystem instead of just having everyone on the same layer one. I actually don't think that is going to be an issue long term, because complexity can be abstracted away by people building on top of it. So for example, you can abstract away absolutely everything with a blockchain, everything with layer 2, layer 1, doesn't matter what it is, by building a front end on top of it and handling everything in the back end for the user. All the user sees is, for example, hey, put your dollars here, you'll earn a yield, and we'll handle everything else for you. And the app that does that handles absolutely everything else in the background. The user doesn't have to know about layer 2, layer 1, wallets, blah, blah, whatever. All they know is that they've put their dollars into this service, and this service is giving them a yield, and how they generate that yield happens in the background. Obviously, there are concerns around that with kind of like safety concerns, like how does the user know where their money's actually going? But the funny thing is the same is true for banks, right? Like when we put our money into a bank, we don't really know what they're doing with our money. Like they can tell us what they're doing. Do we really believe them? Not really, because they're probably doing creative accounting on absolutely everything for a bunch of different reasons, right? But whereas with kind of like crypto, like the same thing is going to happen, where there's going to be these, I guess you could call them neobanks, built on top of crypto infrastructure, built on top of these rails, whether that be at layer 1 or layer 2, doesn't matter. They're going to abstract everything away for the user, and then the user gets the benefits of that. But the thing is that we have the choice. We can either use these services or we can do it ourselves on these layer 2s. And there are going to be other services that just basically simplify this sorts of stuff for people, not to the simplest form that it can be, in terms of like, just throw your money into a black hole, we'll handle all the stuff for you, you don't have to worry about it. But there are still going to be simplifications made on the wallet side of things. So for example, Argent Wallet and is a mobile wallet that basically simplifies it as much as possible. They don't show users seed phrases. They do things like social recovery, so you still have custody of your assets, but you can do social recovery with family members. So if you lose kind of like your wallet, or if something goes wrong, you can rely on them to help you get your wallet back and things like that, without relying on a central party to do it. So there are hybrid solutions that work as well. And these things are abstracting away just the layer 2 part of it. They're not abstracting away the custodial part of it, or kind of like, every single part, but basically the kind of like, infrastructure of having to hop between different layer 2s, or kind of put your money into a layer 2, they're abstracting that away. And then you can even go like even closer to the middle, where it's like, okay, people have withdrawn, tokens from exchanges to various networks, whether it be Ethereum or other layer 1s. Well, now they'll just withdraw their tokens to a layer 2. Like Binance already supports Optimism and Arbitrum. So instead of going to Ethereum, you just go to Optimism and Arbitrum to do your stuff. So it just depends on what kind of like stage of, or what kind of place of the stack that you're at. You can either be really close to the middle, do everything yourself, you're an expert, whatever, or you could be on the other side of the spectrum where you're just like, oh, I don't know what to do. I just want to give my money to this neobank that kind of like, maybe it's regulated, maybe it's fully regulated like a bank, and I'm just going to put my money in there and they're going to do all the hard work for me. That's a totally fine approach. But I think the benefit of all these systems and kind of like, it doesn't matter if it's layer 2, layer 1, whatever it is that it gives users the choice to do what they want. You can either you can be at any, part of the spectrum you want to be at, but and depending on where you're at on the spectrum, you can actually audit this because everything's open source, everything's on chain. So it doesn't matter if you're kind of like in the very centralized side of the spectrum where everything's been abstracted away, you can still see what's happening on chain. You can still audit it. You can audit the trail as well. It depends if kind of like those services give you that information too. Like all they would need to give you is the transaction hash of what they're doing at the end of the day, like where your funds went after they deposited. And you could go look at that yourself. Obviously, we're used to looking at Etherscan, but like most users are never going to look at Etherscan and be able to decode what's going on there. But the point is that we don't have to rely on everyone doing it. All it requires is one person to call this out. Like you only need one person to call out a hack, for example. If we see a hack happening on a chain or to a smart contract, it's usually someone on Twitter, one person that will call it out. And then everyone kind of like gets around it, looks at it, warns everyone. And there's these massive warnings that go out. The same can be true for anything, any of the abstractions. People can just kind of like look at these sorts of stuff on chain and see it for themselves. All these services can warn their users. And I think that's what's going to happen long term. So TLDR is that I'm not concerned about like any perceived increased complexity or fragmentation. I think abstraction will remove a lot of this. I think abstraction needs to be done in a way that's secure and safe for users, but that is a whole nother discussion and something that I think is going to happen anyway, regardless of if it's layer 1 or layer 2. People are going to abstract away as much as possible. So it doesn't matter if it happens on an insecure layer 1 or a super secure layer 2. If the end implementation of that is inherently insecure, if the people running that have like a bug in their own code on their own servers, well, that doesn't matter what you were using. It's still going to be exploited. It's still going to be, result in possibly a loss of funds. So that's how I'm thinking about all these different layers and how they're going to interact with each other and how users are going to interact with it. And yeah, I don't see it being an issue kind of like long term at all.
We've covered so much. You've covered so much around the ETH merge, so thank you for that. To move on past that, like what happens after? So the ETH merge is around the corner. If all goes according to plan here, we're 6 to 7 weeks away. We've talked a little bit about implications, which are relatively minor for the most end users, but what happens? What's the future of ETH for the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, however long years that we have sort of a bit of a vision around?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's that roadmap that Vitalik has posted before on Twitter. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. It's basically a flow chart with all those different phases, like the merge, the surge, purge, whatever. There's like 5 of them, I think. That is basically the next 5 to 10 years of Ethereum. Immediately after the merge, the focus shifts to what's called the Shanghai network upgrade, which is basically, we're hoping to be the surge, which is essentially scaling layer 1 for layer 2. As I was talking about before, things like proto-dank sharding and a bunch of other things, as well as beacon chain withdrawal. So being able to unstake ETH is hopefully going to be in that upgrade too. It may come as a separate one. They may choose to do that as a standalone thing, but those are the things that are coming post-merge, essentially, like immediately post-merge, or 6 to 12 months post-merge is what we can expect there. And the rest of those roadmap items is basically when they're ready. I don't think, as I said, they're not happening sequentially. It's basically, do we think this is ready to go into the network now? Okay, well, let's kind of like make sure that we put this in. But there is a clearly defined roadmap there. There is a clearly defined bunch of items and to-dos that people want in the network. And as I've said before, Ethereum layer 1 has basically become this settlement layer where it's all just going to be done to benefit layer 2. It's not like, I don't think people should be expecting layer 1 Ethereum to be benefiting them as an end user. That's just not how it's being constructed. It's being constructed to benefit these layer 2s. Now, the really magical thing about that is that the layer 2s can move at their own pace. They don't have to wait for Ethereum layer 1 to do things for them. Like they do in a sense that like they have to wait for something like proto-dank sharding to be implemented for their fees to come down on the layer 1 side, but they can work on their own upgrades. And there are actually 2 major upgrades coming relatively soon for 2 of the most popular networks. There's Arbitrum Nitro and Optimism Bedrock. These are both massive enhancements to the layer 2 networks, and they don't need to actually go through layer 1 at all. So they can just do the upgrades on their own as part of their own networks, and that will just be inherited by all the Ethereum users that are kind of like using these networks. And it's been quoted before that Arbitrum Nitro will hopefully kind of bring 10 times more capacity to the Arbitrum network, and that's just kind of like one upgrade. They're always doing these sorts of upgrades. Same with kind of like Optimism, and they can move much, much faster than Ethereum layer 1 can move. So we have this kind of like parallel development of layer 1 being developed in a way to scale layer 2s, and then we have layer 2s kind of like being developed in a way to scale themselves. Right? They're all scaling their own ecosystem, enhancing their own ecosystem, making it better for end users. And it's kind of like this juggling effect where layer 1 will put upgrades in that'll benefit layer 2s, and then layer 2s will grow a lot, and then layer 2s will have to upgrade themselves to kind of like manage that growth. And then they'll grow so much that they kind of like take up the layer 1 capacity. Then layer 1 will have to scale more for layer 2. So it's kind of like this juggling kind of like act going on. But the roadmap that Ethereum has outlined is kind of like conscious of that, is actually being built to support that. And the really amazing thing about Ethereum in a proof of stake world is that the way it's called dank sharding is going to work. So proto dank sharding is just the first implementation of it. And then longer term, we're going to have dank sharding. The amazing thing about that is that the more validators there are on the network, so the more decentralized Ethereum gets, the more scale we get. That's not been true for any chain in kind of like crypto history. Normally, the kind of like I guess more validators you have, you don't get more security out of it. You don't get more scalability out of it. You may get more security out of it, but you don't get more scalability because it adds more overhead to the network. But with the way the sharding roadmap now is, and it's called data sharding, the more validators you have, the more kind of like data shards you can have, the more data availability you can have, which means that layer 2s inherit that extra space and they become more scalable. So we've basically flipped the entire kind of like scalability trilemma, which Vitalik has spoken about a while ago, on its head, and said that no, we don't accept the fact that the more decentralized and secure you are, the less scalability you have. We can do both. And that's basically the roadmap. And that's what's the most amazing thing, is that we're going to like hopefully be able to do both in the next few years. I don't know if it'll come like in the next year. I don't think so. I think full kind of like dank sharding probably going to take 2 to 3 years to come out. But that proto dank sharding, if we can get that launched in the first half of next year, it should give us enough scale for these layer 2s for the foreseeable future and be able to collapse those costs down a lot as well. So yeah, I mean, the roadmap is super exciting. I think that we know where we're going to go now. There's not going to be any major changes, I think, to the roadmap going forward. There'll probably be tweaks here and there, and we'll probably figure out better ways of doing things. But it seems pretty kind of like not set in stone, but pretty kind of like set in its ways for now, and in terms of like what we want it to get done. We just need to build it out, really. And it takes time, obviously, because Ethereum is a huge network. We don't want to break anything. We need to extensively test every upgrade that we put into the network. But as I said, the layer 2s can move faster, and that's where users should be today. They should be on these layer 2s, getting the benefits out of that. And those things are just going to keep growing and growing and growing. And layer 1 is just going to keep upgrading itself to support those layer 2s.
We're getting really close to the end of the interview, where you know very well we ask the same 3 questions of every guest. So we'll get to those in a second. But before we do, Anthony, one thing I want to ask you about, because if I'm understanding your history in the space correctly, you discovered Bitcoin in 2013, and then maybe your attention level during the bear market wasn't really heightened. And then 2017, Ethereum caught your attention and you stuck around, and you stuck around in a big way. You dug in. So the question for you is, for somebody who is either watching this episode or listening to it, who maybe this is their first bear market that they've experienced, what's your advice in terms of, maybe it's tough. Not a lot of people are talking about this space. They're kind of having their own doubts. What's your advice to that person of why it's worth their while to continue paying attention?
Yeah, so I think, look, bear markets are much quieter than bull markets. If it depends on what you want to do. Like, if you want to get a job in crypto, there is still a lot of people hiring. You may have seen like a lot of layoffs happening, but a lot of these layoffs are happening with companies that I think overhired and they got too zealous during the bull market. Whereas there's a lot of startups that are very, very well funded in crypto because they got their funding during the bull market that are hiring, right? And you can go to a website called cryptocurrencyjobs.co. They list a lot of them there, and you can kind of like check out what's happening there. So I think that if you want to get a job in crypto, now is definitely one of the best times to do that. So you can go check out what's there, check out what you like, and basically most, if not all, no, I wouldn't say all, but like most, like 90+% of them are remote jobs as well. So you don't have to uproot your life, go to some office in some other country to be able to work for these things. You can work remotely. And that's true for most of the things out there, most of the companies out there. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that, logically or historically, I should say, bear markets are usually the best time to be investing, because if you are able to invest in the right things in a bear market, no one knows what the right things are, but you make your bets, but you invest in the right things during the bear market. Typically, they perform very, very well during a bull market, right? Like there are some things from the previous bear market that went 100 to 1,000x, right? If you pick the right thing. Obviously, picking the right thing is not an easy task, but you're not going to get 100 to 1,000x, in a bull market on a lot of things, especially in the later stages, because those things tend to launch at a much higher valuation than they would have in a bear market, right? And they start off at and they've already kind of like gone up a lot as well, maybe by the time you've gotten in. Whereas in a bear market, you can do what's called value investing and look for things that you think are going to be really, really big and that have come down a lot, maybe 90+% from their all-time highs, and you think are a good buy for the next cycle. So that's another kind of like big reason why sticking around in a bear market can kind of like pay off. But again, you could bet on the wrong things and then they could not go up very much or not at all, and you could lose out there. So it's definitely a more complex issue than just saying buy anything in a bear market and you'll be rich next cycle. No, that's not how it happens at all. But it's still a better opportunity, much more opportunity in a bear market on that front. If you want to grow kind of like your persona and your profile, maybe you want to grow a Twitter account, maybe you want to grow like a newsletter or podcast, much easier to do in a bear market because there's less kind of like fighting over attention with everyone. So you can kind of like find your community, find your growth vector, and probably grow easier and better in a bear market than you would in a bull market. And also finding your home is much easier because you can find communities that really care about the technology rather than just are there for the speculative activity, there for the price activity. So those are the kind of like the main points that's kind of like what I did during the last bear market is I found my home in Ethereum. Obviously, I stuck around with that. We had a bunch of people that kind of like were really hardcore about Ethereum. We all stuck together. We kind of formed a squad and we kind of like elevated each other during the bear market and then into the bull market. Whereas you don't have to find it in just Ethereum. There are plenty of other ecosystems out there. You can find what you like spending time in. And yeah, I think that leads to the most success you can have in kind of like the next cycle is just taking advantage of all the opportunities that exist in the bear market.
Love it. Well, as Ulf said, this has been such a good deep dive episode. As you know, we have a 3-question segment we ask every guest. You've already been through this ringer, so it's going to have a couple tweaks for your questions, but it's a segment we call You Had Me at Crypto. Ulf's going to ask you those questions.
All right, Anthony, you ready for round 2?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, the first question here is, who is your favorite person to follow in the crypto space? And last time you said Degen Spartan. So what's your new answer today?
Yeah, I think last time I said Degen Spartan because he's just like so funny on Twitter and he posts a lot and it's just a lot of entertainment with I think a lot of good insight sprinkled in as well. Like he's definitely not just some dumb meme account. He definitely kind of like understands the nuances. But in terms of like who I really enjoy following these days and listening to and learning from, there's not just one person. Like it'd be very hard for me to pick one person. It really is like a bunch of people. And I think pretty much all of them would be kind of like on the Ethereum core developer research side of things. They have a lot of really great insights into not just Ethereum, but into kind of like maybe more abstract things around Ethereum, like kind of like society level problems. And Vitalik obviously is one of them, right? He doesn't just think about Ethereum. He thinks about a lot of things and society level kind of like issues and how he can fix them and all these sorts of things. So I would say that Vitalik and probably those surrounding him in terms of kind of like core development and researchers, they're my favorite people to follow and listen to and talk to. But maybe, and I think that might not resonate with a lot of people because those people are very, very in the weeds. So unless you're like really deep in the weeds, those people might not appeal to you. They may be too in the weeds for you. So for me, it makes sense. Maybe for other people, it doesn't.
That's fair. That's totally fair. And I think that's still a great answer for those who are in the weeds. Nowhere to pay attention. All right. Second question here. What will the price of Bitcoin be 10 years from now? Your previous answer was 1 million for BTC and 100,000 for ETH. Do you stick with that or do you change those answers?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I mentioned last time it's like impossible to tell and to know. I think I've actually become a lot more bearish on Bitcoin in the last 18 months, like a lot more bearish on it, even though I've been bearish on it for a while. As I said, intellectually, I don't know if Bitcoin's going to $1 million even in 10 years. I feel like if ETH, or when ETH, I should say, because I do believe it will happen, when ETH flips Bitcoin, I actually don't know what Bitcoin has left for it in terms of like narrative to kind of like push its price up. It'll probably still go up, but I don't know. I don't think it's going to go to 1 million in 10 years. I do think ETH is still going to 100,000 in 10 years. I would stick with that. Maybe I'm being too ambitious, but I mean, it's obvious that I'm much more bullish on ETH than I am on BTC. And I think a lot of BTC's narratives have been shattered over the last 18 months. The inflation hedge narrative is gone. Right, the institutions buying BTC didn't really materialize. There was some here and there, but they didn't really materialize. And some of them even sold it, like Tesla, right? Sold a lot of their BTC and things like that. And I think Ethereum's narratives only got stronger over the last 18 months. And the bull case for ETH only got stronger. So I would say that I'd still stick with my ETH prediction, obviously biased, but I don't really think Bitcoin is going to go to $1 million in 10 years.
All right. Third question. What is the most underrated coin or project in all of crypto? And your previous answer was the Index Co-op. Is that still your answer, or would you have anything new to share as far as undervalued project goes? Yeah, so I think the Index Co-op, I was kind of like part of in launching it when I was at SET. I was really excited about it and really bullish on it at the time. I still think it's a good project, but I think what ended up happening with them, and it's the same thing that happens with every quote unquote DAO, is that they get stuck in kind of like bureaucracy, which is hilarious when you think about it. But a lot of these kind of like DAOs just get stuck kind of like going in circles, and they kind of like, it's like kind of like making decisions to make decisions, so to speak. Like you see this in politics all the time, where it's like they have to vote on the kind of like decision that they're making, but they have to kind of like vote on the decision to make the decisions. Like it's just all this, bureaucracy that goes in circles. And I felt like that creeping into Index Co-op a lot, after that interview. And unfortunately, it kind of like had some negative effects there. So, and as I said, same is true for pretty much all DAOs at this stage. So I would say that I don't think Index Co-op is my most kind of like under the radar project these days in terms of kind of like maybe growth prospects from here. I don't know what is, honestly. I feel like layer 2s used to be very under the radar, but now everyone's talking about them. So I can't really say layer 2s. I feel like people are still underestimating just the speed at which we're going to get a zkVM, which is kind of like considered the holy grail of scaling on Ethereum. But even that is becoming a popular narrative as well. So it's kind of funny because I saw all these things so long ago and now they're becoming popular narratives. So it's very hard for me to give an under the radar project. But I do think that DeFi 1.0, so to speak, the original DeFi protocols are still very, very underrated because they've been battle tested for so long. They're kind of like very secure. They're growing still. They may be quote unquote boring, but I think things like Terra blowing up and these DeFi 2.0 things just, not materializing has reinforced DeFi 1.0 and all these older DeFi protocols and made them kind of like much more, I guess, like popular than they were in the past. And people understand that this is why they're building, more slow. This is why they're building kind of like with security in mind because it actually matters. But again, I think that is even becoming a popular narrative too. So under the radar stuff, I don't have anything right now. I think, as I said, people are still underestimating layer 2s in general. I think people are underestimating DeFi 1.0, maybe even underestimating NFTs. But I think within crypto, these are popular narratives at this point in time, which is good. But it gives me not really something to give a good answer for. That's for sure.
Well, Anthony, there's only been 4 people who have been returning guests on our show, and so we've appreciated having you back. We can't wait till the 3rd time you make an appearance, which hopefully isn't a year and a half out. Hopefully we have you back on sooner because you're so good at explaining everything that's happening with Ethereum. Thanks so much for joining Alf and I on this episode of Show Me the Crypto.
Yep, thanks for having me. Very, very keen to be back a 3rd time, hopefully in the near future.
Thank you for listening to Show Me the Crypto. Please make sure to subscribe as well as rate and review this podcast.